following that very good in-depth talk, up next we have John Keyworth. John is an Oxford-based designer of megagames and also indie RPGs and other video and board games, both hobby and professionally. John's completed megagames include Relics of the Fall and the Nexus City. And today, John's going to talk to us about treating the economy as terrain for your megagame. Take it away, John.
Okay, thank you. So, click. That's good. Right. So, the economy as a terrain for your game. Yes. Talk. What I'm going to try and present today is essentially an extended metaphor. The aim of which is to perhaps give you a new way of looking at your game's economy. If you look at it from a different perspective, it's quite often useful to see problems you might not have seen otherwise, or to see solutions that wouldn't present them in another way. So unlike the last talk, which was a bit more concrete and nitty-gritty, this one's a little bit more, up in the clouds, but hopefully it'll still be useful. So first, we will define a couple of terms, very similarly, I think, to how Alex did in his. So there are two main parts in megagame design. So we have the roles. So in this, I'm including your team, your goals, your relationship, everything that's part of usually comes in your role briefing, essentially. And then the other part is the economy, which I'm defining here about as broadly as you can get away with. So that's all the resources and the mechanisms for your game that players are playing with. Yes, and this is important to remember. Like we've heard before, this isn't just money. Troops, you can train them, you can spend them in battle rather callously. Votes could be traded. Actions are usually the most important economy in the game, is the action economy. So yes, it does apply widely. So if we are going to think about roles and economies in our game, then perhaps we should imagine what it was like to not have an economy, so that we can see what we're talking about essentially through its absence. So if you have roles, but you don't have an economy, you've got goals. You know what you want to achieve. How do you do it? Good question. Freeform games exist. They're a thing. They're very, they're very popular. They can be very good, but it's not typically what you're expecting from a mega game. So maybe you ask and control nicely. Like it's often very hard to know where you stand. It's often hard to know what to do next unless you've got the mechanical underpinning that sort of gives you a framework to work with. And especially for new players, I find that just a very open brief with no rules underlying can be intimidating. So these are all things we're hoping to get from our economy. So moving on to the analogy, to our extended metaphor. Right, so the roles could be said to be moving around the game's economy, much in the same way that someone could be moving around some terrain on a map. And by transforming your economy into a map through this metaphor, we can do all sorts of interesting things, because maps are great, and yes, which is very on brand for me, I think. But yes, they're very clear. You can see what's what. They're usually good for sort of inspiring action. Like I was saying, if you've got an economy, you've got a set of mechanisms in front of you. It's much like having a map in front of you. You can see where you want to go. You can look at it and you can see how to get there. Right. So we'll explore this analogy a bit. So we've got a game with no terrain, so we've got these roles. They're just floating in the void, and we've given them goals. How on earth would you get to your goal? You've got no terrain. You just go straight there. Very straightforward. Not much of a game to it, essentially. So let's try making it more interesting. So same analogy again, the same situation again, but with some terrain. So we've got some roles, we've got some goals. I'll put a little bit more on the roles this time because we're going to need it. So we've got a bit more game. So we'll have some terrain. So we've got a river, we've got some cliffs. So the boatman can cross the river, the mountaineer can cross the cliffs. But all of their goals are currently obscured from them. They can't. The boatman can't get to the boatman's goal because there's a cliff in the way. So now we've got a bit of a game. Now we're thinking, okay, well, the boatman will make a deal with a merchant maybe to say, well, I'll take you across the river. In exchange, give me some climbing equipment. And then the merchant can go on to their goal, but the boatman talks to the mountaineer. I will take you back if you'll help me up the cliff. I've got the climbing equipment. So they go back across. The mountaineer helps the merchant up the cliff and then continues to their goal. Suddenly, we've got a bit of a game. We've got a small amount of, we've got some interaction between the players, and they have to think a little bit about what's going on just by adding a little bit of terrain to our blank map. So that was obviously a very simple analogy, very simple situation. But if you've got 20 players, 40 players, 100 players, however many, it starts to get very complicated. They've all got their own place on the map. They've all got their own destinations they want to get to. You can start charging things. You know, boat might need fuel. Maybe it can be upgraded. Maybe there's a helicopter pilot who can ferry people around all sorts of places. That was a cooperative example. Competitive examples are almost even easier to imagine because you've got wargaming to fall back onto. But you know, we can imagine having an economic struggle against someone, say between two corporations. The economic terrain in which they choose to fight might mean it be advantageous to one corporation over another. So the same kind of things apply. Right, so before we get too lost in this metaphor, what does all this mean? What is the point of it all? So the terrain is the game's economic possibility space. So this is kind of represents all the things in the game, all of the states that you can be in. In reality, a game's sort of possibility space would be a sort of a 20-dimensional non-Euclidean mess. But we're trying to keep it simple so that we can actually understand it a little easier by simplifying it down to just a flat map. Starting position, that's where you are, what resources you've got. You know, you have troops, currency, votes. The journey is you literally just playing the game, essentially. Quite a nice feel that you're taking actions in the game in order to move you through the economic possibility space. And then the destination is your goal. If you know, where do you want to have visited? Where do you want to end up? You know, if you can't end up where you want to end up, where's the second best place? That sort of thing. That's what all these things represent when you sort of pull back out of the metaphor back into your game. So why is this useful? So first, yes, couple of ways you can think about designing a game, which this can help with. So you can design your terrain first. You can map out your economy, or you can design your roles first. You can say, well, who are these interesting people and where do they want to end up? If you've got your terrain first, which is probably the usual way of doing things, you then need to get the economy designed and find some interesting start and end points for the roles. The other way, which I'll start to sort of warm to a bit more, getting the roles first, and then you're designing the terrain, you're drawing the map around them, and coming up with some interesting obstacles and interesting ways in which people can interact with them, and making interesting interactions between players that they'll need to do in order to overcome these obstacles. So that's one way we can use this analogy. The other way, so if you imagine terrain, there are different types of terrain. They have different effects on a journey. So we've seen the blocking terrain where it blocks movement, so you can block people from using certain game systems or resources or access to certain mini games. Causes interaction because you need people to help you to interact in that way. That's sometimes a bit risky, but difficult terrain is another thing. Hills and deserts and the like. Slow down movement. If some people get a discount, some people don't on prices, that creates these difficulty to move in areas that apply to players. Obscuring terrain, maybe some people just don't know something. Maybe you're not allowed in a room, or you're not allowed to look at a certain map, or you're not given certain briefing information. And then the inverse of this, the helping terrain, roads, lookout points, forts. If you can get yourself into a certain situation, maybe you can, get access to that information, and that helps. These are particularly useful because players can, if you've got a map in front of you and you need to get somewhere and you see a road, well, that's quite obvious. It helps people out, basically. It's a good way to get people into the game and get people going, to give them a road to walk down. And at least at the start, they can do that. When they get ambushed halfway down, or when the bridge gets destroyed that they were planning on using, they have to change their plans, and that's the game, and that's fine. But helping terrain will give people a good first steps on their journey. So other things, action types. So you can interact with terrain in different ways. So you're moving around, you're buying and selling goods, gaining and losing advantages from being in certain positions. You can terraform, you can open up new routes, you can destroy things. And then again, helping and hindering, you can do the same, but for other players. It encourages interactions. So putting it into use. So this is a slightly more practical, hopefully. So imagine we're writing a cyberpunk game, as many people like to do. Good idea. So we've got our corps and we've got our runners. And we're going to try and transfer this into the metaphor, into people in terrain, people on the map. So our corporations, they're large, they're powerful, but they're kind of slow to react. So maybe they're a bit like a sort of heavy cavalry kind of. We go for a slightly military bent on the analogy. They could be like baggage trains. They could be slow but move a lot of stuff. Depends how you want to transfer them into your way of looking at things. And then you've got the runners. They're weak comparatively, but they're kind of nimble. They kind of can get around and do things that corporations might struggle to do. Maybe they're skirmishers, they're rangers, they're scouts, that sort of thing. So we've got these roles. So one way we can do that is say, well, we need some terrain that's going to be advantageous and disadvantageous to the different sort of types of role we've got in our game. There's no point in making, like in this, there's no point in putting in a C, something that you would represent as a C, because neither of them get any benefit or penalty from the C compared to any other. So we can say we've got some open plains, will be very good for the cavalry. We've got some forests, not bad for skirmishers. And because we want to encourage interaction, we want to try and put some of the corporation goals inside these forests so that it's hard for them to find. So that's a way of sort of using the analogy. Obviously, you have more than 2 roles and you have more complicated in full game, but I've only got a few minutes. So we're using this, how could we get back to actual game rules, to an economy, and some actual roles and some actual interactions? So corporations, powerful, hard to maneuver. Server actions are 100 times as powerful as the runner actions, but they only get 1, and they have to commit to it, turn in advance. So that's quite it's quite sort of powerful, but it has the same kind of disadvantages you'd imagine from our heavy cavalry. Whereas the runners, maybe they get 10 small actions. They can do a lot of things. They do very little with each of those things. They're still a lot less powerful than corporations. But you can do an action, see what happens. Do another action, see what happens. You're very nimble. You're very quick. You're a lot like these skirmishers. There are other ways you could convert those ideas back into your game. It depends what your game's like, but these are just examples. So when you're trying to achieve a goal in an open plain, the sort of the legal side of the net, corps have clear advantage. So you can imagine these sort of cavalry jousting on the plains, trying to win corporate sort of government contracts and these big lumps of cash that they're going to get. But any of their goals that are inside the dark forest, in the sort of the dark web side of things, they could go in with their big one action and they could blunder into the forest and maybe they would stumble across their goal, but they can't really see what's in there. If you're uncovering a card and then using the results of that card to uncover another card or something, like, it's hard. If you just got given 10 cards all at once, you just have no idea. You couldn't use the information you got from the previous action to inform your next one. So they'd have a disadvantage. What they need to do is have some interaction. They need to talk to the runners and get the runners to nimbly go around and use their little action. And then they can use the large amount of money that they've got from their jousting in order to pay the runners for whatever it was they're after in the forest. So that's a very sort of quick and sort of ugly way of seeing how we can, by viewing our economy in this light, we can then sort of lay things out and then transform it back into game rules that are, will maintain the sort of things that we put into them in the simplified state. Yes, so that is basically it. View your economy as terrain. View people, your roles as people moving around on the terrain, which can inspire you to try new ways of approaching problems. And for players, they get given their brief, they get given the rules, and hopefully, if you designed it well, they'll be sitting there they'll have their map laid out before them. They'll be able to see where they want to get, and they'll be able to kind of have an idea of the journey that they want to have before them. Yes, so that is that.
All right. Thanks very much, John. And
okay, I hope that made sense.
Virtual round of applause for people while I. And if people can pop their questions into chat while we're waiting, John, I had just a hopefully easy question, which is: do you find this a useful model for analysing the economies of games that have already run as well? Say, identifying slightly more metaphorical bottlenecks in the activity?
So this is a relatively sort of new idea that I've had. So I haven't. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting idea actually applying to existing games. I certainly think we need to analyse existing games more than we do, perhaps. I think if we want to sort of get better at design as a community. So actually, that might be something I might go out and try. Actually, be fun.
All right, I think we're just waiting for people to type things out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's only I've not sort of. Oh
yeah, so there's a question from Seamus here. Are you envisioning this as a way for designers to teach their economy game to players quickly? And I think to extend that, is it also a useful tool for control on the day?
I wasn't envisaging it in that way. I was hoping that if you can convert, if you yourself can convert to sort of terrain and back again, then hopefully you've designed your economy in a way that is easier to explain, but I don't know that players would get much out of getting confused by.
Sure, filling the rule book with metaphors is maybe not the
Yes.
most
But
efficient.
hopefully, if you've used something like this to simplify your thought process and make a very you can make a clearer economy that the players can then understand more simply, essentially, because
Sure.
they need to, that you need to have the equivalent of looking at a map. When you're reading through rules, what you're having is a map described to you in text, and certainly, the way I try and approach playing a game is trying to understand this sort of possibility space that you've laid in front of you, so that you can do the thing that you want to do with your role. And so, yes, if you can lay it out clearly for yourself, then hopefully you can lay it out clearly for your players.
All right. Okay, we've got a question here from Johan. What are the biggest advantages from a player perspective of having asymmetry in the game economy, whether that's your literal map or the team structure or this within the metaphor? Or
Yes, so the way I would see that, I mean, especially sort of within the metaphor, would be say with the boatman example, right at the beginning, you're forcing people to talk to other people. Normally, if you've got a more free-form game, you've got a brief, and it says, you need to make an agreement with player A, and you need to stop player B from doing something. You're talking to player A and player B, but you're not really sort of mingling with everybody else. Like, one thing in these more sort of cooperative scenarios, asymmetry adds the requirement to talk to other people in order to get the thing done that you wanted to do. In a more competitive example scenario, I think most games are fairly asymmetrical in that respect. But yes, it just gives you, like there are different sort of places where you want to, it like terrain, it gives you the ability to sort of outmaneuver your opponent, essentially, if you're being competitive.
Sure. Perhaps to go back to your military metaphor, it necessitates the use of scouts. And do you think that scouting is fun?
You can have roles that work like scouts, you can have roles that work like cavalry, and all that sort of thing. So you can find out people, you can fortify places, you can all this is asymmetry means that it becomes a lot less homogenous, and you're both looking at it from different points of view. And also another thing is megagames usually suffer if they're sort of zero-sum games. Usually if there's asymmetry in the economy, then people are getting very different things out of it. So a win for one player is not necessarily a loss for the other, at least 100%. So there's always room for more deals and for more interactions if things aren't completely homogenous.
Yeah, definitely. And lastly, we have a comment from Ezra that you've made him start thinking about the recent events in the Suez Canal. And then just an open question, also from Ezra. What's the most interesting environment and / economy interaction that you've seen in a mega game?
Ooh. There's a question. Open question. I don't know. No, I'm drawing a back blank.
Okay, maybe pop that in chat later on. Or
I'm not the best memory person with anecdotes, so it's hard to talk things on the fly.
All right, no worries. Okay, in which case I think I'll hand over to Holly to bring in our last speaker.